This is episode 595 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm very pleased to be joined by William L. Kovacs. He is former senior vice president at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and has written several books, most recently, Devolution of Power, Rolling Back the Federal State to Preserve the Republic. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Bill.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so before we get too deep into your books and the ideas behind them, especially your most recent one, you are the first person that we've ever had on Tipping Point, New Mexico that has worked at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And this is one of, if not the very biggest pro-business lobbying voices in New Mexico, or in the United States, I should say, I'm sorry. And you testified and were involved in rulemakings, especially on the issues of regulatory reform, energy, environment, climate change, telecom, data quality, and government transparency. And these are all issues that we care deeply about at the Rio Grande Foundation here in New Mexico. So talk a little bit about your work at the Chamber and how you see the Chamber now that you've been retired and now are writing books about limiting government.
I think the first thing we have to appreciate is that the U.S. Chamber today and the entire business community today is different than the 20 years when I was there, and I retired 7 years ago. So you've got the business community today is much less worried about free enterprise or open markets and much more worried about subsidies and being bought off by the government. They're much more willing to do what the government wants. And I think a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act and what is the subsidies that are involved in there sort of proved that point. When I was there, we focused on two things. One is really going after and trying to defeat all of the climate legislation. We had 4 or 5, and we might have had 6 bills over my 20 years, and we defeated them all. But we defeated them primarily because of what they did. 700, 800, 900 new regulations were going to regulate the entire economy of the United States. They were going to, for every business that they gave preference to, they were going to take the money from other businesses and give it to them. So that was the first one. And the other really big issue, which I think was probably far more important than even climate change because it deals with the entire how government operates, was really the administrative state and regulatory reform. We were somewhat successful in the sense that we got permit streamlining passed, which is the Biden administration did away with. But the second thing was more important is how you restructure the administrative state so that the agencies don't run the government, and Congress has more control, and the courts focus on legislative intent more so than giving deference to agencies. So it was a collection of issues. But at that point in time, the issues, as you can see, that I worked on were mainly how do we take power away from the government and turn it back. The first part of that is, and then I'll quit talking, is how does Congress reclaim its power? Because that's essential. Until Congress decides to wake up and reclaim its power, whether they be emergency powers, spending powers, whatever it is, it's kind of hard for Congress to have control over the country. And the second big issue is procedurally, how do you control a federal bureaucracy that believes that the courts have sanctioned it to do whatever it wants to do, and Congress can't get that back.
So I guess I have to ask, what changed at the Chamber? Do you think it's just a matter of the political winds of the Biden administration being, kind of prominent in Washington, and that maybe things that the Chamber will move back to a more, I don't know, principled approach? Or is there something fundamental that has changed in American politics that has caused the Chamber to get behind this kind of subsidy and government intervention approach?
I think you've hit the essence of the issue. That Biden came in, and the difference between what Biden did to grow government and what Obama did. Obama tried to do it by regulation. Biden never went the regulatory route. He went the subsidy route. And so two parts of the subsidies. One is spreading a lot of money to a lot of industries. And the second part is the use of tax credits. And that's something very few people understand, because when you use tax credits, you really can't control spending. Tax credits are for whoever can meet that criteria gets the money. And the best example is in the Inflation Reduction Act. The CBO estimated that it was going to cost about $400 billion. Within a year, they raised the estimate. Goldman Sachs raised the estimate to $1.2 trillion, and it's probably going to be far more than that. And then you add all of the subsidies that are going to go to the tech industry for the various new industries that they're going to build in the United States, then the battery recycling, and the list sort of goes on. But when you get done, you're talking trillions of dollars, and because they're tax subsidies, because they're tax credits, they're not part of the budget process, and they're no longer reviewed by the appropriations committees. They're just there, and whoever wants to claim them can claim them.
Got it. Okay, so that's an interesting point. And now that you mention it, yeah, Obama definitely, and I think Obamacare being the preeminent rule and regulation of the Obama administration, is that he definitely pushed regulatorily, whereas Biden has tried to use the tax code to get what he wants done. Although the recent vehicle, mostly electric vehicle push seems to be more of an Obama era or regulatory push on the part of the Biden administration.
But when Obama was doing it, we were talking in the billions of dollars. Right now with Biden, we're talking in the trillions of dollars. I think that's the difference. And the tipping point for business was they realized that they could continue fighting regulations, or they could just take the money and do it. And I think if you look at the auto industries, especially the American industry right now, they can't sell their EV vehicles, but they're still persevering, and they're afraid to speak up because they know that if they speak up, they'll be penalized and they won't get their money. And that's a long-term problem for the American business community, because if you're bought by the government's going to control everything you do. And that's the major change that's happened between the Biden, Trump, or Obama, and then Trump, and now with Biden. It's gone from a belief that markets could control something to a belief that subsidies are the way to build markets.
All right. Well, let's talk about a couple of your previous books, and I'll let you dive into them directly in either direction. The two that I have here are Reform the Kakistocracy, Rule by the Least Able and Least Principled Citizens. You were given a 2021 Independent Press Award for Social and Political Change for that book. And then you wrote a second book, The Left's Little Red Book on Forming a New Green Republic. Talk about both of those if you want to.
Sure. Well, Reform the Kakistocracy. Kakistocracy means government by the least able and least principled citizens. And that was really when I left government, and I had a year when I left the chamber and being active in both lobbying and challenging the federal government through the rulemaking. I really had the time to reflect as to who these people are and how the system is structured. And if you go back, I went back in the book, I traced it back to 1816, when the Supreme Court finally said that the federal government not only has enumerated powers, it has incidental powers, and nothing in the system can change that. And from that point forward, the federal government expanded, and it really took on for the first time the spending clause, because the big debate between Hamilton and Madison was over spending. Can the federal government spend on anything it wants, or is it limited to its enumerated powers? The court said no, it's not limited to its enumerated powers. It's limited to only what Congress believes is incidental and needed to run the federal government. At that point in time, federal supremacy became the concept that ran the republic. But because it was practical and they didn't spend a lot of money, really through 1900, the states had more of the domestic policy, and the federal government had the security of the nation around. And in fact, at that time, states actually, their cumulative budgets were more than the federal government. Beginning around 1912, when the election when Roosevelt ran as an independent and got more votes than the Republican, the parties fundamentally changed who they were. And they decided that what they needed to do was to protect themselves. And that's when all of the election laws came into effect, and they eliminated really the ability of third parties to get on the ballot. From that point forward, you see the federal government operating through the parties. The parties control it. And this is really crucial, because you've got to ask yourself, if the two political parties control it, and they appoint the courts, they elect members to Congress, what happens to the separation of powers, which is the real key to the Constitution? Because if you want to limit a government, you have to have a Congress that doesn't worry about the president, that worries about the Constitution. And they don't necessarily side with the president. And the situation we're in now is that the Congress, take the Senate right now, the Democrats will always protect Joe Biden. So you can't impeach him, you can't investigate him. He doesn't have to turn over documents, and that's all because the Congress has decided it's a political entity, not a separation of powers, which they have under the Constitution to protect the powers of Congress. And the results of that are staggering. You have 136 emergency laws in the United States, so the president can do whatever he wants at a moment's notice, and Congress can't get those powers back unless they pass a law, and the Senate's not going to let them pass the law because they're not going to be able to break a filibuster. So that's the first thing. Then, as they have all of these accumulated powers, they protect the president. So if the president is under investigation and doesn't want to produce documents, he doesn't have to. But the bigger issue is if the president wants to spend money, such as student loans, Congress can't stop him. The court did in this instance, but Congress can't. And so Congress has delegated so much power, and that's what reform the taxocracy is about. It's about, look at the system that we have, and you find yourself with, you're not any longer protected by the Constitution. You're protected by two political parties, a Republican Party and a Democratic Party. And that's the only protection we have. That was my first book, and it was just really one of those, you might think it was an epiphany. It was really something that had been on my mind for years. And at the chamber, I try to focus on my interests on restricting the federal government through administrative reform and rolling back the administrative state. The Left's Little Red Book on forming a Green New Republic is just a fun book. You can read it in 25 minutes. While I was at the chamber, we wrote a book called the Environmentalist Little Green Book. And it was a series of quotations, both are a series of quotations, to show what the environmental movement really wanted. But we did it to sort of spoof the environmentalists, because at that time they were just beginning to build up their power on the climate change issue. And we really wanted to take on what it is that these people were thinking of. For example, when you go through some of the major writing in the from the environmentalists, they call humans a cancer on the earth. One person talks about the best way to get rid of humans is to give a kid a machine gun. I mean, these are prominent environmentalists who are writing these kind of theories. And this goes back really into the 1920s as they began trying to educate the public. So I did that book just for the fun of it, because we did the Environmentalist Little Green Book, and I wanted to do something on the Green New Deal to show really what the genesis of the Green New Deal was. It has nothing to do with environment. It has to deal with control. And the point that the book makes is that if you look at government control, think about how you do it. You can pass a million laws, but if you use climate change, you can literally control almost anything. You can control cars, you can control trucks, you can control food, you can control the 6,000 products that come out of petroleum. You can control almost anything in society. And I wanted to bring to the point that climate change isn't about protecting the environment. It's about the government control. And that's why for 20 years at the chamber, I dedicated our activities to making sure that the climate legislation was not passed. And if you realize that the climate change legislation that passed by Biden in the Inflation Reduction Act was a giveaway. It wasn't a regulatory bill. They're controlling through money now, as opposed to regulations and laws. And then finally, the latest book, Devolution of Power.
Yeah, and that's a very good transition there. Devolution of Power. Now, obviously, these are topics and themes that you've written about in your work already, and obviously in your professional life. And thank you on behalf of the American people, and especially New Mexicans and New Mexico, which you may not know is the second biggest oil producing state in the entire country these days. And our really entire state economy, state budget are based on that mineral wealth. But let's get into Devolution of Power and your new book. And by the way, you can find it at Amazon.com for $10 through Amazon Prime in paperback form. So definitely not a book that you're trying to fleece anybody with overprice there on this particular read.
The question? What do you want?
Yeah, no, talk a little bit about the book.
Well, the purpose of the book, when you're retired and you have a chance to read 3 or 4 newspapers a day and watch a lot of television and think and read books, you begin asking yourself a very fundamental question. What do we do with the federal government that's completely mismanaged the nation? You have a $34 trillion debt. What do you do? How do you pay it off? We're paying $1 trillion in interest. You have 20% of the country that does not any longer want to pay. They don't trust the federal government. So the question I wanted to ask is, what do you do? You've got a polarized nation where people don't trust the government and it's mismanaging the nation. And I just had to personally answer that question. And so you're not going to have a separation of states. That's not going to happen. The federal government's not going to let that happen. You're not going to have states go into groups or geographic regions. That's not going to happen. Nothing that limits federal power is going to happen. But what is going to happen at some point in time with the $34 trillion debt and growing at $1 trillion a year is the federal government is going to so devalue the dollar that they're no longer going to be able to support themselves. And something has to happen. And let me just give you one statistic, because it's the kind of statistic that affects New Mexico and every other state, and that is the federal government gives the states, again, going back to my let's buy them off theory, about 40% of all state budgets on average is federal government money. So the federal government gives the states on average between $1 trillion and $1.2 trillion a year. What happens when the federal government can't pay the states to do that? So what does the federal government pay the states for? It pays them to run between 1,000 and 1,300 federal programs. And that's a lot of federal programs. And a lot of the programs, the federal government doesn't have authority or the jurisdiction to implement themselves. So what they do is they say, we would like this done, and if you do it, we'll give you money. So the states have they've done the same thing with the business community. Everybody's being bought off in the system. At some point in time, the system is no longer going to work. So with that conclusion in mind, I decided to say, okay, what is it that you do? How do you take this system and begin to unravel it? And the big question there is, where's the constitutional authority to unravel it? And that's probably the easiest question to answer. If the federal government could, over the course of 200 years, could expand their power, over the course of another century or half century, they can begin to decrease their power. If it's inconstitutional to increase it, it's constitutional to decrease it. So how do you do that? And that's where the devolution of power comes in, because at that point in time, the federal government starts to unwind the mess that it's created, where it collects $4 trillion, spends $6 trillion, and it's got to unwind this. And the second thing is, you have over 225,000 federal regulations. How do you begin bringing back freedom to local communities and to states. And so that was the fundamental building blocks that I wanted to focus on as we begun thinking, how do you devolve power to the states without some kind of a revolution?
Okay. So in an article that I'm reading about your book, it says rekindling the idea that government officials must serve as fiduciaries, not self-interested politicians. Talk about that.
That is probably the most central idea, and I wish I could take credit for it being mine, but that was an idea that was started by John Locke back in the 16th and 17th centuries. And the theory is simple. Power does not, the Constitution does not give any power to an individual. The power that the Constitution gives is temporary to people who are to manage the government for the benefit of the Constitution and the United States. So if these people don't have power, how is it that they are supposed to act? And this gets back to what I was talking about before with the separation of powers. Each branch, the reason the separation of powers is so important is that's the one mechanism that every single elected official has to limit the power of the government. And when you act as politicians to advance the power of the presidency because the president is a Republican or a Democrat, you're breaking your oath. And so the fiduciary theory is very simple. When you're elected to Congress, your duty is to the Constitution and to the power of Congress, to the role of Congress. What's the role of Congress? They're the legislative body of the United States, not the president, not the courts, Congress. They're the spending authority of the United States, not the president. So a role of a member of Congress isn't to enhance the political party or the power of their political party in the White House or the judiciary. Their role is to enhance the power of Congress, and that's all they should ever work on. Likewise, the president is there, the executive is there to execute the laws of the United States, not to implement laws, not to write new laws, not to write laws through regulation, not to spend because they think they have the power to either impound funds or create new funds or print new money. They don't have those powers. And the fundamental reason that underlies this is we all think of the federal government as the ruler, as the United States. The federal government is not the United States. The United States is a federation of states and people. The federal government, under the Constitution, is a mechanism to manage the nation. And as a mechanism, we have a right to change it. And that's the fundamental problem with the United States right now is we've gone from being a separation of powers where our elected representatives limit power to being a political system in which we don't care what the Constitution says. We only care if the Republicans are in power or the Democrats in power. That's why that concept came out of John Locke. That's 400 years old.
So what mechanisms do you envision that that change this paradigm, if you will, because it's obviously tough. And even in New Mexico, we have a position called land commissioner. They manage the oil and gas on the state-owned lands, and they're supposed to legally act as fiduciaries, but it's very questionable as to what they do and whether they do that or whether they're more self-interested politicians. How is there any mechanism that you see shifting this, or is it something of getting the American people more engaged in this process?
Well, I think first of all, from a practical point of view, devolution of power is going to happen because the federal government is bankrupt, de facto bankrupt, and it's going to run out of money and it's not going to be able to spend. So it's going to happen. The only question is whether or not we can begin managing the change or whether or not that we collapse as part of the change. And managing the change requires several things. One is, and the most important thing I can think of, is Congress has to reclaim its power. It has to reclaim its war-making powers. Do you realize that other than World War II, out of the 65 or 70 wars we've had in our history, we've only declared war 5 times? And we haven't, all the wars since Vietnam, including Vietnam, have not been declared. So Congress has to do several things. One is it has to get its war-making powers back. It has to decide it is the institution that declares war, not the president, not the War Powers Act, not 90 days of combat and then another grace period of 90 days and it continues forever. Congress has to get it back. Second, Congress has to repeal all 139 or 140 emergency powers. And these emergency powers, you saw some of it during COVID, but if you go through the emergency powers that Congress has authorized the president to undertake, it includes telecommunications, transportation, airports, health and safety, you name it. It includes everything. So Congress has, the first step is you can't even begin to think of devolution of power until Congress can get its powers back because Congress can't legislate. It's that simple. Congress can't legislate. If no matter how good the piece of law is, that unless you have the 2/3 to override a presidential veto, or you have the ability to get the Republicans and the Democrats to work together, and they're not going to in a political system, you can't get Congress to get its powers back. It has to be an institutional quest where Congress wakes up one day and says, these are powers that we have to get back because we're the legislative branch. So getting your powers back, you got it. That's crucial.
No, absolutely. And I totally agree with you. I'm a huge fan of everything that you're saying in this book. And I'm just trying to figure out how we can actually get there, because that's the challenge. Providing alternative mechanisms for rolling back federal power. Obviously, in terms of just the Federal Reserve would seem to be a place to go after. The idea that the federal government can just print up money and tell the states to do whatever they wish them to do, or provide payments to them to get them to do whatever the administration wants to do in Washington seems to be a fundamental problem. But how do you see these alternative mechanisms?
Well, I mean, there are several. The most radical of all is to call a Constitutional Convention of the states, which the states have the power to do. The difficulty, again, is you have red states and blue states, and neither are going to cooperate. So you got to take that off the table. I think the first thing that you have in a simple form is Congress could establish what I'd call an intergovernmental commission, states, local governments, and federal government, meaning Congress, and to begin to sit down and think about an honest approach to how you divide power. And I say that because once Congress can't afford to continue bribing both industry and the states, something's going to happen. So you might as well face up to the fact that the states need to come to the table and begin to say to Congress, until 1900, 1912, we managed most of the domestic laws in this country. We're going to continue managing those and let those powers come back to us. Second, it's not like the states are going to lose a lot of money, because they might even make money. And the reason is that if the federal government gives them 20, 30, 40% of the money for a program, they may not want that program, but they have to put in the other 60% of the money. The other thing they have to do is they have to put in the staff and the resources to do it. So that's one way, is an intergovernmental commission. Another way is for the states to simply say, we don't want any federal money. We keep your federal money, and we're not going to implement those programs. Think about it. Congress doesn't have any more money to spend, neither does the federal government. They don't have the money to populate with bureaucrats every state that decides to do it. It's sort of like a Gandhi type approach of non-cooperation. We're just not going to cooperate. And there are some states that are doing this. Look at what Texas is doing to try to preserve its border. Look at what Utah is trying to do with its sovereignty legislation. So it's out. The idea is out there. The other thing is you've got what they call the interstate compacts, where the states can join together and do what it is they want. I thought the easiest thing is when Roe versus Wade was overturned, you were going to see the states use an interstate compact clause to begin organizing as a group of states to sort of do uniform legislation. But you've got a variety of mechanisms between the Commerce Clause, the compacts, intergovernmental commission. You also have what a lot of the states did, and northern states did during the Civil War, personal liberty laws, to make it so hard for the federal government to deal in a state that they don't want to be involved with them.
All right. Another point that you have in here, or that is in here, is practical options for trimming the national debt and the federal bureaucracy. And this is one that, man, it seems like if there is one area of bipartisan agreement in Washington, it is that just spend, spend, spend. And it's something that, while my preference is for Trump over Biden, if I had one or two big areas and they're related, Trump actually, exacerbated our economic challenges and helped to set us on this inflationary course through his overspending and some of the COVID relief packages. Biden has taken that and said, hold my beer, and done even more. So it doesn't seem like anybody in Washington has any willingness to address the debt or the federal bureaucracy. To maybe a lesser extent, the federal bureaucracy. It seems like Trump has some ideas on that, but certainly in the debt area, there's not a lot of push for addressing that.
Well, I mean, let's just take some practical approaches. Right now, if you look at the rules of the House and the Senate, you cannot vote. It's out of order to vote for any law or any appropriation that is not authorized. Pretty simple statement. The law has expired and no one reauthorized it. Yet every year, Congress goes to the floor, no one offers a point of order to say we can't fund this. Someone deems all of the laws that are not authorized to be authorized, and they just spend the money. So, for example, in the last several Congresses, they've funded well over 1,000 laws that were unauthorized for over almost $500 billion. So the easiest thing to do is just go by the rules that you've already established. That's $500 billion right now taken off the table. The second thing is you return, so you have $1 trillion. The next thing is you go and you tell the states, you're going to have to, you don't need all these laws, and we shouldn't have given them to you in the first place, so we're going to stop it. We're going to stop funding all these state programs and let you guys take over. And it may not be all that bad, because the states are going to pick up some programs they don't want to spend any money on, and they're going to spend it on programs that they want. That's another $1 trillion. So with two simple things, one is stop funding the states, which is going to happen anyway, and two, don't fund unauthorized laws. You got $1.5 trillion, and you haven't even begun. And then you've got a lot of other little things, like, for example, I think it's the Congressional Budget Office. They've written several reports on the fact that there are about $250 to $300 billion of unauthorized payments every year. How do you have 300? I can see a couple $100 million, but 300 billion? And so you're almost at $2 trillion, and you haven't even gotten to the next 7 or 8 points that I put in there. And then for the federal bureaucracy, which you talked about, everyone says, well, you can't do anything. You know, they've got their jobs guaranteed by life by the Supreme Court. That's not true. It's only true. The only time a federal employee has a right to a trial is if you're going to fire them for cause. If you risk an entire agency or a part of an agency which saves billions, you don't have to go through those protections. So if you go through each of them, and I sort of, as I did, some were bigger than others, but you can get to a couple $1 trillion without breaking a sweat. But that means you want to stop spending money and get control of the government. And that's the problem in Washington. It's not that it can't be done, it can be done. It's that they won't do it.
Well, it's I think there's no greater challenge in American government than restraining and returning our government to our federal government to a more appropriate size. we're going to have to leave it there, or just a few minutes. But any final points, anything that we missed in this conversation that you want to make sure to get across to listeners, and if folks are interested in buying this book, Devolution of Power?
Well, throughout the book, the key theme is separation of powers. If members of Congress got elected and functioned as fiduciaries to the institution of Congress, and the president acted as the president to execute the laws of the United States, and the courts did the same, I think you'd find you're in a position where you can do it, but it's got to be done by the people who are elected have to want to follow the Constitution. They have to want to be members of Congress, not members of the Democratic or Republican parties. And that's the key point. And if I could do anything, is during a campaign, you ask a member of Congress who's running, or a challenger, who are you going to represent when you get there? And they're going to talk about, I represent so-and-so, and I'm going to represent this group and that group. That's not the issue. The issue is the separation of powers requires the fiduciary responsibility to the institution, not necessarily to every interest group.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Bill. And again, the book is available through Amazon and other sources for reading material. Devolution of Power, Rolling Back the Federal State to Preserve the Republic, William L. Kovacs, Kovacs. Thanks for your time and all your service with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, trying to preserve our liberties, and look forward to checking out this book. I ordered it while we were waiting. I haven't had the chance to read it just yet, but I will. I just ordered it, so I appreciate your time today, and we'll talk to you again soon if and when you come out with another one.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Take care. All right. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.